Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye in Auditorium of Audacity. I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnoff, representing Stitcher Radio and Z-Talk Radio. We're starting our trek to Halloween. Yeah, I know, it's not even mid-September. I don't care. I'm starting the celebration, raising that freak flag. We're opening the X-Files, taking out the cryptozoology folder, and putting in a new Bigfoot case. Depending on your whereabouts, you might know this mysterious, hairy, bipedal creature under another name: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, Wild Man, Forest Devil. Man, that's my favorite. Abominable Snowman, or some other of the dozen other names that Bigfoot has. Tonight, author and photographer John Zada, he'll join us to talk about his trips to North America's Pacific Northwest, where stories of the mythical creature run deep historically, specifically in the Great Bear Rainforest, which contains more organic matter than any other terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. So really, there's no other better place to set our sights. On this edition, John's going to share his Bigfoot stories that he collected from conservationists, scientists, and indigenous people during his adventures, and compiled in his new book, In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch, all when the Mind's Eye returns. You're listening to the Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. Our Facebook and Twitter subscribers at Mind's Eye Show already got a little sneak peek of tonight's guest and some of his Bigfoot stories. They're also probably reading our latest article about another legendary giant in Siberia, same place where the first whole woolly mammoth was discovered back in 1901. I'm not getting political with this, but climate change is altering the landscape there, and some of the thawing is exposing other oddities, like the severed head of a 32,000-year-old wolf, once preserved in the permafrost 65 feet underground. Take a look at the article by subscribing at Mind's Eye Show for Facebook and Twitter. A digital hug for all those who do so. Appreciate it. Or just go to quick links at themindseyemedia.com. Definitely the best spots to get more information about the show and our guest who joins us, John Zada, talking about his search for Sasquatch. We'll be right back in a Mind's Eye moment. We welcome writer, photographer, and author John Zada to the Mind's Eye, who I think may have been Henry David Thoreau in another life. John, thanks for some of your time tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We are talking about his new book, In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch, part adventure journal, part psychology book, part history text. Am I missing anything in there, John?
No, it pretty much covers it. It's kind of multidisciplinary.
Yeah, and it really was a fascinating read. And now the setting of the book and the search itself is in the Great Bear Rainforest, epicenter of all the things Sasquatch. And now this book didn't really start off as a Sasquatch investigation. Tell us a little bit about the origin of the book and kind of how it molded into a Bigfoot hunt.
Yeah, so I grew up in the, I guess, the 70s, the early 80s when Sasquatch was a big thing, and I became really interested in it as a kid. And probably like a lot of Sasquatch enthusiasts who are, my age or older, I'm in my, late 40s and everything. So I carried that interest into adulthood, and it's sort of, it has come and gone basically, right? And so the book origins were in a travel article that I kind of went out to the West Coast to work on. And I basically was going to do an adventure piece on this area on the West Coast, and went out there, spent some time, and kind of without looking for it, I came across all these Sasquatch stories. And, that sort of reconnected with all of my childhood interest and some more somewhat relatively more recent things that had happened in terms of things that I'd heard later in adulthood. And it sparked my interest. And I thought, this really beautiful, pristine region, which is, at the center of some controversies because of the industrial development and whatnot that had threatened it, I thought that would make for a really amazing story. And so I decided to go back there and do a book project on it.
At the end of the book, you pose an interesting question, and the premise is that it doesn't even really matter if Sasquatch, Bigfoot, if it exists. More important is what the pursuit of Sasquatch tells us about ourselves, about our motives, individually and as a culture. So what does our search for Bigfoot tell us about our culture?
So yeah, my investigation basically begins as a quest to determine whether the Sasquatch is real or not, and then at a certain point in the story, I begin to realize that there's a lot more to it than just does the creature exist, because that is just one question with one answer, and it's one dimension of the whole Sasquatch thing. And so I think there's loads of areas that are touched upon by that whole what does it tell us about ourselves thing, from our perception. How does our perception work? How do we see the things that we see? How do we know what exists? Why do we believe what we believe? And so the Sasquatch encapsulates those sorts of issues, but it also touches upon the area of human motives, like why do we seek the Sasquatch? Is it? I mean, there are of course professional reasons for those who are interested, scientific reasons, but even those can perhaps be kind of rationalizations of what might be deeper motives, like our attempt to reconnect with a wilder part of ourselves, to the pursuit of excitement, to the pursuit of fear, to wanting to be out in the wilderness, wanting to be out in the wild. And so in a sense, the book became a journey to kind of unpack or unfurl and discover, include and using myself as a case study, because it's written from my perspective. Why are we attracted by the creature? And so that's the road that I go down.
And I'll pose that same question to you. So why have you been, obsessed with Bigfoot, at least starting with childhood and then later picking it up for this? What does that tell us about you?
I think there's several levels to it. I'll give you just a few because I don't want to spoil it for readers. But on one level, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto, and it was, like a lot of suburbs, it was very much I don't want to like diss the place, but it was very much a mediocre environment. I mean, and the one thing that was the saving grace of where I grew up was a ravine, a green belt area, and so I grew up both with the benefit of having some contact with nature, but also being somewhat having a bit of revulsion for my kind of flat, mundane suburban existence. So I think in one sense the Sasquatch encapsulated this, mystical, mythical, mountainous Pacific Northwest landscape, because when I grew up, that was the area that was most associated with it. Nowadays, you get Sasquatch stories everywhere. So my interest was a pursuit of, in a sense, mysticism and landscape and beauty and wonder in a way, right? And I think that holds for a lot of other people. On one more level, if I can just add one more point, I think it was the supernatural implications of the Sasquatch. It being, elusive, intelligent, self-aware, really fast, kind of appearing and disappearing. It almost had a kind of, it felt like it was a demigod of some kind. And I think, again, not to give away too much, but I link that own fascination in myself to, I think, almost everyone else is interested in the Sasquatch. I think people pursue it because there is a kind of almost godlike dimension to the creatures. It's portrayed in a lot of commercials and in pop culture as this kind of oafy, dumb, goofy, like in the Jack Link's commercials, right? Like this kind of goofy thing. But when you hear the stories and you hear the accounts and you talk to the native people, the indigenous people, like it does have this level of, I don't know if the right word is spirituality, but it's definitely got a kind of, the word sublime, I would say, sublime qualities. And it's almost religious, I would say, even.
I want to just stick with you just for a moment and talk about how the Sasquatch, it's not just relegated to one location. It comes with different names, different areas. It all depends on your region. It goes by Yeti, Forest Devil, Bigfoot. Now, you're of Arab descent as a child, and your obsession with Bigfoot. Did you ever ask your parents, is there a Middle Eastern version or an Arab version of the Sasquatch?
No, because I grew up knowing that there generally wasn't, from all of the stories and the tales. But in the Middle East, we do have the jinn, which is I mean, I think maybe in North American or American culture, the whole idea of the genie that comes out of the bottle. There are creatures that are similar in spirit, in a sense, to the Sasquatch, and they can be either, malevolent or benign, and they tend to live in wells or in water. They're essentially sort of personified spirits that occur frequently in Middle Eastern and Islamic culture, and they're known as the jinn, and that, I would say, is the prime candidate for something sort of human-like and semi-legendary and mythological in that part of the world. And it being a desert area now and being kind of a place of wide open spaces, there isn't really a lot of forest. So no hominoid primate type creatures. Although if you go back to ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumer times and pre-Babylonian era, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a kind of great work of I guess it was an oral story that got put down into the writing of the time, featured a being named Enkidu, and he was this kind of wild man type creature. So there is actually one reference to something Sasquatch-like in the Middle East, and it would be found in that text.
Sticking with the wild men part, is there like a different, do we categorize wild men in the same under the same umbrella as Bigfoot, or is it kind of a different animal, or so to speak, in itself?
Well, I think some of the early researchers, scientists, people like John Napier, probably even John Green in Canada, they started coming up with this term wild man to denote hominid or hominoid or primate type creatures who occur around the world. It's more of an umbrella term that transcends cultural references. So in one sense, Bigfoot, Sasquatch does fall into the wild man category, but also I think the term also refers to an archetype. Like if you go to any country in Europe, Eastern Europe, the Scandinavia, like anywhere, there are a lot of wild man stories that are not necessarily, let's say, cryptid related. It could be humans or human type ancestors who are known in other cultures as wild men. So it's both you could refer to Sasquatches and Bigfoot as wild men, but it also has a cultural implication that transcends references to even cryptids.
What do you think? In the book, you talk briefly about Theodore Roosevelt referencing wild men in his own book. What do you think he was referencing? Something like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something like just a wild man in the forest?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it really depends on whether the creatures exist or not. And I'm somewhat in the middle. I tend to oscillate back and forth depending on, stories I hear and my mood and everything. But I mean, I think that if there are Bigfoots, it's quite possible, if not likely, that the story that Roosevelt referred to was something that he had heard from someone else referring to these actual creatures. I mean, it sounded, something like it. So, I mean, I think Bigfoot enthusiasts and researchers do tend to point to that story as, even though it's a fictional story, as to possibly, being some kind of an anecdote, a sort of anecdotal evidence, perhaps, if you will, of stories circulating that far back in time of the actual creature that people are seeing today.
Based on the premise that they do exist, and Bigfoot researchers generally kind of put them in three categories: uncategorized animal, an alien, or some type of supernatural entity. With with mysteries like these, I tend to kind of lean toward Occam's razor. Generally, the simplest answer is the best explanation. So, if Sasquatch exists, in my opinion, it's probably an unidentified animal. And like you just said, that your belief kind of waxes and wanes throughout the whole book. So where do you lean now, and if you believe in it, and if it does exist, what do you think it is?
I mean, I would put my my emphasis more on the flesh and blood interpretation. I think that, similar to your take, I think that is the most likely explanation for the creatures. I see where the paranormalists come from, those who put forward the multidimensional, dematerializing, multiverse traveler creature. But I can understand in the sense of there is a need to explain its rarity, its elusiveness, why it does seem to suddenly vanish once a person sees it. But I don't know. I wonder if it's not simply perhaps that they may be a highly evolved, highly self-aware, highly intelligent creature that simply has evolved in forest and mountain and wilderness environments, have become incredibly skilled at moving and maneuvering and hiding. And so it's almost as if their sleights of hand, their movements are almost to be perceived by us as almost magical, because they're so skilled at what they do. And I think that has led some people to the conclusion that, more mystically minded people, because at the end of the day, anyone who's going to put forward that interpretation is going to intuitively lean towards that view of the universe to begin with. They only then, describe the Sasquatch in that sense after having already been a person interested in that view of the world. So I'd probably say more flesh and blood. Not to say that there aren't mysteries in the world and that the universe is not a mysterious place, but that's more my take.
Yeah, I don't want to say never, never say never. Who knows? No way we can explain it. But if we're trying to, scientifically research this, we got to kind of go with something that we can at least prove. So, that's kind of why I lean toward not just the Occam's razor aspect of it, but if we can do it, let's try and prove it. And that's really going to be the only way that we can prove it, if it is a real animal of sorts that we just haven't really categorized.
Right.
And I think it's interesting that you bring up the level of intelligence. It does seem like, it does have to be incredibly intelligent. We generally tend to kind of view animals as less intelligent as us, but it has to be incredibly intelligent if it's evaded capture for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Right. And when you speak to people who investigate the phenomenon, or talk to even people who claim to have seen them or have bumped into them or have had encounters with them, often what arises is, descriptions of, its retreat being almost calculated. Like, I heard one story in Bella Coola on the central coast of British Columbia and it's an older story. It's about a group of hunters who were gathered at their fire, and then, this creature screamed at them, and they looked up, and there it was there, through some trees, and they kind of got up and went to go look at it, and then it ran off. But the really interesting thing about the story was that the way it ran off, it was in the springtime, I believe, and there was still some snow patches on the ground, but the creature, when it ran off, ran in such a way as to avoid the patches of snow, meaning stepping on the patches of snow. So it actually ran around them or over them, and the interpretation of that by those who were there at the time was that it didn't want to leave any footprints or any impressions in the snow that could be later followed. So and yeah, you hear that all the time about from people about how it may have circled a camp, and when they go and they look for evidence of its movement, they could see how it was moving from, like looking at the foliage, the broken foliage, how it would move from tree to tree. And so you do get that a lot, this almost sense that these creatures are just like skilled at, they may not be camouflaged in the visible sense of having the same colors and blending in, but they certainly know how to avoid detection by just stopping or pausing or crouching or blending into a tree. And so, and that may be their main skill, in the same way that a spider's skill is to weave a web to capture, insects or whatever. I mean, elusiveness is their stock and trade.
Do we think that the level of intelligence, because it is so highly intelligent, explains why there's no hard evidence if it does exist? I mean, how do we? I mean, that's really the most obvious question tonight. I mean, why is there no hard evidence?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, perhaps it is that elusiveness. Perhaps it is these creatures avoiding humans for the most part, and therefore, when they die, we generally don't find their bodies, or we don't find any remains, or that is the key question here. I mean, that's why it remains a mystery, right? Because I mean, we don't have anything to show for this, and yet people continue to see them, and on the edges of their communities, and sometimes even in places that are not as remote as the Great Barrier Forest. I mean, you get reports on the edges of larger towns or even smaller cities. And I mean, Vancouver even. I've heard reports in the North Coast Mountains north of Vancouver. I mean, that's how close they come. So, yeah, I don't know. That's why it remains a mystery. We don't have anything yet. And so what is going on? I don't have a definitive answer.
In your travels, you probably heard hundreds, maybe even thousands of Sasquatch encounters. What would you say is just the stereotypical or the typical Sasquatch encounter?
The most common ones I heard on the central and north coast of BC involved people who were out in the bush, basically either largely fishing, largely recreating in their boats, or gathering, like the indigenous people who live on the coast also go out to gather food and resources, like the sea and the rainforest is their dinner table in a way. So one story I heard a lot of was staying overnight in cabins. So like, because the area is so vast and because the weather can be so inclement there and given to lots of rain, they build a lot of cabins across their territories as places to like backcountry huts, essentially, for hikers, except for these are for residents who live out there. And so the really big recurring story was cabins being, I wouldn't say attacked, that might be a little bit of too harsh of a word, but definitely banging and shaking on the cabins. That was a really big one. A lot of rock throwing incidents for fishermen and for people who are, let's say, digging clams on clam beaches. A lot of wood knocking and hollering. So these are the more frequent tales that I think recur over and over again all across the continent. But definitely rock throwing and cabin shaking were the two most popular, or rather the two most frequently reported stories to me while I was there.
And most of it doesn't seem to be too malicious. I mean, if they wanted to attack you, if they're 9 feet tall, they could. Most of it, would you say most encounters aren't really frightening in the sense that they're trying to attack you, maybe just trying to scare you to get you out of the way?
Yeah, that's the consensus, is that they're generally, when they throw the rocks, it is, I mean, some people talk about it being a playful thing, and John Bindernagel, Canadian Sasquatch researcher who passed away recently, and also a wildlife biologist, he thought that perhaps, the creature's intent with the rock throwing depended on the size of the rocks, that, if they threw the smaller little, pebble-sized rocks, it was more them being playful with you. But when they threw the larger, heavier, more dangerous rocks, it was more of a get out of here sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think the residents of the coast did often talk about boundaries and about them leaving Sasquatches alone, Sasquatch is leaving them alone, and there being almost a kind of an understanding, an implicit understanding between them that they would not transgress each other's living space in a sense, and as a wild primate, we could imagine it having these territorial issues. So that is the way it is seen up there.
A lot of the stories that you heard were from first Americans, and that's for United States people, that's essentially the Canadian Native American version. Now there are reports and talk about how their ancestors dealt with Sasquatches even before white men arrived. I mean, how far back do those first American tales go back?
Well, I mean, they're oral tales, so we don't actually know how far. We can assume they go very far back, hundreds if not thousands of years. But in terms of those individuals who have the stories and who are alive today, they got them from their parents and grandparents, and even in some cases, great-grandparents. So we could at the very least, I think, trace some of those stories, back to the beginning of the 20th century, maybe the end of the 19th century. And the stories are not, the majority of them are their tales, their lore, they're not like literal stories of things that have happened. So you get a whole tradition of these almost sort of, I don't want to call them mythological tales, but they're more stories for story's sake. And so that's one category where you've got these wild men type beings who inhabit the world of the ancient stories, and they're told at the potlatches and the big indigenous ceremonies. And then you've got the actual anecdotes of things that had happened to people's parents, people's grandparents, and when they were out, fishing, they saw this creature. So they definitely do come in two categories, and I encountered both when I was on the coast.
And some of those that you talked about actually said that they had dealings with them. Now, maybe depending on how you interpret the word, can kind of give you an idea of it. Now, by dealings, did they mean they actually dealt with them, traded with them, interacted with them at some point in their history, or was, like you're saying, that it's don't bother us, we won't bother you, one of those like treaties of sort, so to speak?
I was told by one person in one of the communities that I was in and someone who is a cultural authority in her community, that according to her elders who had heard it from their elders, that the Sasquatch going back at the very least a few hundred years ago were considered to be almost a group in and of themselves, a tribe of themselves, and that there was trading, there was conflict, that they actually had relations with them in the way that one indigenous group would have relations with a neighboring group. And so that's what I was told. I was told that there was actual goings on, of a give and take nature. So, of course, it going so far back, I didn't really get any specific details of what that meant. But I think the point was that they were a coherent community that dealt with them. And I think even that's not even specific to the place that I had visited. I think I've even heard of other, First Nations or Native people in North America talk about them as the same way. They would call them, let's say, the Sasquatch people, like that they're almost seen as equals, that they are a community, they are a nation, or they are a group, and that is how they're remembered or thought of in certain places here on the continent.
How would you say what is the main difference or big differences between First Nation tales and then contemporary tales of Sasquatches?
Well, in terms of the actual anecdotes of eyewitness encounters, there is no difference really. I would say that Indigenous people reporting their Sasquatch experiences are essentially reporting the same type of phenomenon, the same type of creature, the same behavioral qualities, that like a white person would report. So I mean, so those two come very, they're almost the same, I would say. I think the difference again with the indigenous would be more in terms of how they view the creature, and so you do get a little bit more of the perspective of Sasquatch as being supernatural, or having some kind of a shape-shifting ability, or an ability to disappear, to dematerialize. There is a bit more of a supernatural bent in general to the indigenous take. But having said that, I will also say that I was really surprised by how many native people also just don't believe in Sasquatches, because a lot of them hunt, a lot of them fish, a lot of them spend loads of time on the land, and many of those people have never had an experience. And I think for them, their attitude about the whole thing is, well, these creatures can't really exist because I haven't seen one. And in addition, this is also really interesting. In addition, a lot of tales, fictional tales for children, like boogeyman stories almost, to kind of frighten kids and make sure that they don't misbehave, involve Sasquatches. So I think that when children grow up to become adults in indigenous communities, they tend to almost be biased against the existence of the creatures simply because they were frightened by their parents at a very young age, and saw the Sasquatch as kind of a tool in the repertoire of the parents to control them, basically. So you hear a lot of people who've actually seen them will actually say afterwards, I never believed in the Sasquatch because my parents used to scare me with tales about them on purpose to keep me in line, and I just thought it was really just a scare story.
Yeah, I think there's one quote in the book. I believe that it's your travel guide, Clark Hahn, I believe, or where he's talking about his encounter. He wasn't really a believer. He says, "I'll believe it when I see it," and then when I did see it, I asked, "Why me?" I thought that was an interesting part of the book.
Right.
For
Well, and he also, and he comes from an area. He comes from one region of that area that I traveled in where the people there tend to fear the creatures more than in other parts of the Great Bear Rainforest. There is a much greater culture of taboo and fear associated with the creatures in Bella Coola than in other parts. That was my take anyway. But
during your travels, you would find communities, as you mentioned, that pretty much had a dearth of Sasquatch tales. I mean, how do you explain that difference? Why in some areas that there is, in some areas that there isn't?
Well, those communities that really didn't have very much in the way of Sasquatch stories were non-native communities. And they were non-native communities that were located like almost directly next to the native communities that had loads of stories and encounters. And so, that was a really, really, really interesting thing in the book. And so I'm, as part of the unpacking of the whole phenomenon that I was trying to do in the book to kind of lay everything out. I mean, I mentioned that how odd it is that, Denny Island and Ocean Falls and Hagensburg, which are essentially non-native communities, although located right next to them, had almost none, right? There was almost nothing. And so, I mean, what I put forward was two possibilities. Perhaps it could be an indication that, Sasquatches maybe do not exist, as a physical reality, as a species, and therefore the indigenous communities are seeing more in terms of what they believe, or perhaps, and this could be just as likely, that, because the indigenous communities know what they're looking for, because they have been on the land for countless centuries, because they probably have perceptual templates of things that the non-native don't. Perhaps they can see them better and they can identify them more quickly, and perhaps they may even have what we would refer to perhaps as a sixth sense, or perhaps their right brains may be more in tune with reality than our very left brain Western, Anglophone culture, right? And so, these are all really, this was a really, really, really interesting point that came up in the book. And again, yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to actually, I could only put forward the possibilities.
Yeah, you talked about how it's not just the right place, but and the right time to have an actual Sasquatch encounter, but you also have to have the right mind. Your consciousness of a person actually has an influence on whether you see one or not, or at least that's what I believe was recalled by the first Americans.
Yeah, one of the characters in the story who had a bit of a more philosophical approach, put forward this idea that, there are a lot of factors involved in seeing. And so, yes, I mean, part of my whole exploration into this involved looking into, the psychology of perception and the psychology of belief and just the way our minds work and how we see what we see. And one thing that was really fascinating in what I discovered was that, our breadth of vision, at least in terms of identifying objects in our immediate, in our immediate vicinity. I mean, our mentality and our mindset, depending on what it is at the moment, will determine what we see. So when we're in a state of mind which is, very acquisitive, we're trying to impose our will on something, we're hunting, we're looking for stuff, we're grasping for things, when we're greedy, when we're ambitious, it narrows our perception. So in a sense, like Sasquatch hunters, any kind of a hunter or someone who's looking to manipulate their environment and who are looking for something specific are only going to be looking for those patterns in the environment to the exclusion of all other patterns. But then a different mindset, which is more relaxed, which is more accepting, which is a lot more, let's say, non-manipulative, just kind of, I guess, more of a passive mindset. When it's not in pursuit of something or trying to do something or trying to manipulate something, takes in a lot more of its environment visually and in a sensory kind of way. And so I go through that in the book, not as a way to perhaps explain why some people see them and why some people don't, and that perhaps those who do see Sasquatches are often you hear this thing about people seeing them when they're not looking for them, when it's unexpected, and it's almost like the Sasquatch is this kind of thing that surprises people. So yeah, you almost wonder if those who are looking for them tend to not find them because they're limiting their perception by the very pursuit of the creature itself.
Why are there not more scientific pursuits, serious ones? Someone like John Bitternagel, who's he was a scientist. He did a serious scientific inquiry into Sasquatch. Why are there not more? And really, I guess the underlying question is, why is it so scientifically taboo?
Well, that's the answer. It is taboo. I think that's the reason why. I think it's still considered in urban culture. So I mean, professors and scientists tend to be, they work in universities. Universities tend to be in cities, and I mean, these are urban cultures. These are, and universities are, in a sense, and professors, they're the temples and they're the high priests of rationalist orthodox belief, right? And so I think in order to appreciate the phenomenon and to see the possibility of there being a reality to all of these anecdotal accounts and trace evidence and whatnot, you have to at the very least, I think, spend time in these environments and talk to people and get a sense of the landscape, and you have to almost be out in those places in a way. And I think so long as these professors and scientists are holed up in their in their offices and in their labs and in their ensconced deep within their own work cultures, with its own groupthink and with its own pressures of funding and like people want to keep their jobs and make a living and make sure that they progress materially in life. And so I think there's an argument to be made for them to not really go there. And John brought that up a lot. He spent a lot of time trying to convince his colleagues. He would put forward, papers to conferences, scientific conferences, and some of them actually even let him come and speak. But I think that there is a perception that, the likelihood of this being true in some capacity is almost zero. And yeah, it's a culture. It's hard to break through.
For you personally, what do you think is the most convincing part of Sasquatch, or at least evidence or encounter that you even heard?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, because I'm, in a way, it's going a little bit on faith, because I could talk about the Patterson Gimlin film and talk about how the creature purported to be in it is of a massive size. It's got muscles. It sort of ripples as it moves. Like, the film is fairly convincing when you put it side by side with all the innumerable attempts at hoaxes with these droopy, unconvincing, flat kind of, cheap, Halloween type costumes. So there's the film. And then you have scientists like, Jeff Meldrum and, Grover Krantz before him, who, that talked with great conviction, with almost certainty, about the anatomical bona fides of the more convincing Sasquatch tracks and casts, and how it was indicative of ligaments here and bones here and toe movements. And of course, I'm not an expert in this area, and I can't sit down with him and contest or verify this for myself. So in a sense, I'm like, okay, you guys are the scientists. You know what you're talking about. You may also be naturally predisposed to this mystery anyway to begin with. So maybe that is clouding your judgment. But when I hear them describe the footprints like that, it's kind of convincing in a way too. So I think it's those sorts of things. And then of course there's the eyewitness accounts, and a few of those stories are really, really, really convincing. Some of them less so. Some of them, you're not sure what to make of them. So I don't know. It really is a thing. And so I think at the very least, it's something that our culture should look at and pay attention to and try and learn from. And perhaps even some individuals investigating it as a literal undiscovered creature, perhaps. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think we should disparage people from investigating, because it is it is in the spirit of science, a scientific pursuit.
I think defining Bigfoot is also tough now, because you talked about in the book that, we have this imagery of Bigfoot, 9 foot, hairy, but you found possibly that there might even be different species of Bigfoot if they exist.
Well, that's what people talk about. And again, this isn't something that I have found myself, because I only focused on one region for the story. But yes, there is some degree of consensus in a general sense that there might be more than one species of these things, like smaller ones. People talk a lot about Bigfoots that are like child size, but they're not actually juvenile. They're actually like smaller Bigfoot type creatures. And then when I went, again, going back to the Bella Coola example, they have a creature known as the Sninick, which is a wild man type being, and it is tall, but it's not really entirely fur covered. It's more of a, thin patches of skin on a kind of a clammy, whitish sort of body. And so, yeah, again, when you're dealing with indigenous and native cultures, they have a lot of supernatural beings in their pantheons, and so again, some of them are more human-like than others. Some of them can transform themselves into humans. So, like, the lines really begin to get blurred when you go really deep and ask every single person. And that was one of the things I found on my trip, was that was that there was a belief in more than one type.
Some of the descriptions tend to give them more of a female quality more often than not. Well, why do you think that?
Well, I mean, I think if they're a biological animal, you're just going to get half and half, right? So, and perhaps, perhaps the females are closer to communities. They're gathering. They're around their children. I mean, I don't know. I can't. I mean, this is a whole area of very wild speculation. But I mean, yeah, I think at the very least, if we're talking biology here, we're talking males and females, and I think perhaps when people see breasts, it more easily identifies them as a female as opposed to them not seeing them and therefore not knowing if it's a female or not. So I don't know.
And don't be afraid to go down the rabbit hole. We're kind of there already. Our whole conversation is premised on the idea of Sasquatch exists. So let's keep going.
No,
down.
I know.
And some of those other descriptions talked about that the Bigfoot would have a gaze of death. Well, how do you explain that, or what's the kind of the story behind there?
Well, again, in some of the in Bella Coola, where the creatures are more feared, again, by comparison, the neighboring community of Bella Bella, even though it could be frightening to see a Sasquatch, there isn't this existential terror bordering on fear of death I found in that community as opposed to Bella Coola. And I think with Bella Coola, it was there is this almost sense that if you see one, it's really, really bad news for you. Like you don't want to see one, and if you see one, you need to get away as quickly as possible. And that, I think in some cases, if you lock eyes with it, something really bad will happen to you. And that is the sort of overall belief system in the community. And so, I mean, you hear about, even in other reports in North America, you have these stories about where the person is stopped and the Sasquatch stops and they both look at each other, and that somehow the person felt that the Sasquatch kind of could read their mind or was looking through them or was projecting some kind of energy or a power through its gaze. I mean, and which could also really be attributed to just the intense fear of seeing something you've never seen before and something perhaps monstrous and perhaps ugly, right? And so my sense was that it may have been a combination of those things in Bella Coola, and that they have this belief that you don't want to come across one, but you certainly don't want one to look you in the eye, kind of like a Medusa thing almost in a way, right? I mean, in that ancient Greek story, I mean, people would be turned to stone if they gazed into her eyes. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one way of seeing the creature, and I think it's one that's specific to probably more than just Bella Coola. There are probably other communities where people believe the same thing, but there is definitely an intense terror of where somehow your soul is laid open when that thing looks into you, and that was the stories that I was told in the community.
I only have you for a couple more minutes, so I got to get you to weigh in on some of the remaining Bigfoot debates arguments. This is probably the biggest debate within the community. Is where do you stand in the plural? Is it Bigfoot, big feet? I mean, what do you say when you're talking about multiple Bigfoot?
I mean, I've gotten in the habit of saying Bigfoots, I guess, because I think that's what I'm seeing in the media and the documentaries and that kind of thing. So that's just rubbed off on me. So I would say Bigfoots. Yeah,
it's just something about that just sounds so grammatically wrong that I just can't say it. I have to say big feet for some reason, and I know and Bigfoot's actually makes more sense, but big feet.
Well, when you say big feet, you do conjure up a visual image of big feet, right? And not necessarily of Bigfoot's big feet. It could be anybody's big feet. So Bigfoot's is kind of it's almost more ambiguous, and therefore it works better somehow linguistically.
Now, continuing with our premise that Bigfoot does exist, and I know that many of our listeners have been probably rolling some of their eyes this whole time, but we appreciate sticking with us. But under the premise that it does exist, I thought something that you brought up in the book was kind of funny, but also somewhat concerning. Is that if we do find Bigfoot, would that actually have a positive or negative effect on them? Would they get actual endangered protection, or would they go extinct just because that's kind of what humans do with these type of things? Where do you?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do feel that it would be a negative thing for them overall, because I mean, if the way we treat our environment, if we don't consider ourselves, even ourselves as a species and its welfare in the way that we formulate our environmental policies, let's say, and in terms of how we treat the world, we're not going to necessarily be concerned for another creature or another being, even as novel as the creature may be. I mean, it may start off as being a kind of poster child for some kind of change in our behavior, but I don't know. I mean, because they're so elusive, because they are, so great at avoiding us seemingly, in one sense, I'm not that concerned, but that an extra few people are going to somehow eliminate them. But yeah, I don't know. I think that all the journalists and all the hunters and all the scientists and basically everybody's going to get in on it. And I think, yeah, I don't know. It's just an intuitive sense in my case that it may be better for them to be left alone and to be kind of considered, a pseudo species, perhaps at best. I don't know. I mean, that's just my feeling.
Where do you plan on continuing this investigation, or did this adventure kind of soothe your soul in the search for Sasquatch?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of the intention behind undertaking this book project was, in a sense, to free myself of what was a childhood obsession that became, an adult pseudo obsession, and I don't know. I don't quite think I mean, in some ways, I do feel I have put my mark down. I put my 2 cents worth. I have done it's a travel writer's account of the Sasquatch, and so in a sense, I do feel like I have done what was sort of begging to be done with it, within me in a sense. But at the same time, it's sort of like that story of the Hydra. You chop one head off and two grow in its place, and you do get a little bit. It is really fun to kind of go to other communities and talk to people and hear their stories. So in a sense, I do feel I have done something. Yes, it'll be put to rest in one sense. In another sense, I don't think I'll ever be able to not ask people, or to look out for stories, or to read articles that come up. I mean, I will definitely not drop it. And so long as it remains an unsolved mystery in the whole, in the general sense. I mean, I know for some people it's not a mystery, they've seen them. I think I'll always be interested.
Tell our listeners where they can get more information about the book and yourself, so they can hear these stories of Sasquatch.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch, and in the U.S., I think it's in bookstores right now. It's on sale, and you can find it at your Barnes and Nobles and your local bookstore, and on Amazon. For Canadian listeners, the Canadian edition will be out in August, so you can pre-order it on Amazon or wait for it to come into your stores. And finally, if you want to read more of my journalism, you can go to John Zada, JohnZada.com, and that is my writing/portfolio website as a journalist, where I've got a whole bunch of other articles that are not about Sasquatch, although I do have a couple that are. So I've got one on Harrison Hot Springs there, so you could also go read that if that interests you.
Yeah, it's not all just completely weird stuff. In fact, most of it isn't really. So I definitely recommend it when I check
It's a really cool subject. So I just have to say I am really into the subject. So I'm not coming on here to debunk or poo-poo or whatever. So
Well, I think that's what our listeners appreciate. That's kind of where we go. We're not here to prove or disprove. We want to hear, what your story and what you encountered, and let them decide based on what we've given them. So we're not here to decide
and where I
for
went,
them.
totally. Where I went was a really, really, really magical, beautiful, wondrous part of the world, and I mean, just that alone made for a really fascinating journey and story. And I think combined with all of the Sasquatch lore, it sort of supercharges it.
Bigfoot, big man, John Zada, we appreciate stopping by the Mind's Eye.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
It's the Mind's Eye wrap-up. I know, tear running down your face and all. Listen, you know me by now. If you don't know me by now. Anywho, you know that I'm a skeptical believer in some of these stranger things here. I mean, to me, straight up, like I said before, if Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever other name you want to throw out there, if it does exist, then, I just think it's some type of clever, unclassified animal. Here's the important part. What I like most about stories of Sasquatch, ghosts, really all that stuff as we continue our trek to Halloween, is that it invites the unknown back into our lives. It makes us wonder and really long to wander. Compelling stories like the ones on tonight's show, it really does make you do all three. We plan on doing that on the next episode. We'll be back in a few weeks. Until then, be well, let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnov, signing off for the Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio.